right, folks. So today we're going to be talking about faith oppression. So the way that I'm going to move in this lecture, I'm going to cover important terms. Then I'm going to cover uh, the 5 phases of religious oppression that is outlined in your book. So according to the syllabus, there's the first lecture. This is the first lecture. The second lecture is going to cover a more detailed is going to have a more detailed examination of faith oppression in U.S. America. Additionally, we're going to be talking about stereotypes in that next lecture. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the book chapter in the next lecture. So if you're expecting a book chapter today, nope. It's just going to be faith-based oppression. So some important terms for us to know are listed on this screen here. So I'm going to go through each of them and do my best to give an academic definition for each. So let's start with theist. So this is the first one here. A theist is a person who identifies a belief in a higher power. So I say higher power can be God's, can be God or gods in one being or some form of energy. Now, an atheist is a person who lacks belief in a higher power or powers. So typically what people hear are what is talked about with someone who's an atheist. An atheist is someone who doesn't believe in anything. That's quite untrue. Atheists do have beliefs, just not, they lack the belief in a higher power. An atheist believes in, they can believe in love, they can believe in different things. It's just the difference between an atheist and a theist is the theist identifies their own belief in a higher power or powers, whereas an atheist lacks that belief. So there you go. There's a difference. And we're going to talk about some stereotypes of atheists in the second lecture. Agnostic. So with agnostic, for someone who identifies as agnostic, there's this belief that the knowledge or presence of a higher power or powers is unknown or unknowable. So a lot of people talk about agnostics as if they're soft atheists, as if they're not willing to, or as if they're a cop-out. So agnostics, they do experience stigmatization for their, I would argue, for their belief in uncertainty and being comfortable in that uncertainty about the presence of a higher power. And we're going to talk about that in the next lecture as well. Just so you know, an agnostic is someone who believes that the knowledge or presence of a higher power or powers is uncertain or unknowable, okay? Non-religious. So when we talk about non-religious, people automatically assume that it's only referring to these categorical labels. So if you identify as non-religious, you're automatically an atheist. That's not true. So when we think about religiosity is actually a spectrum. Same thing with if you take that, same thing with non-religiosity. That's a spectrum. So to be quite clear, when we think about religiosity and non-religiosity, they're actually a spectrum compared to a categorical based spectrum. Not spectrum, but categorical based thinking. So you can be non-religious and not be an atheist. So on the non-religious spectrum, you can have atheism, which is more so on the extreme of the non-religious spectrum. You might have a person who is spiritual but not religious. You might have a person who is a naturalist. You might have a person who is agnostic. So they would be right a little bit in that middle. And then you have a person who's a religious none. The point being is that when we think about non-religiosity and non-religious, it's not just this categorical based system where a person who is non-religious is automatically identified as atheist. You can be non-religious and not atheist. Okay. I mentioned the religious none. So this is a term used to describe a person who doesn't identify with the religion. Now, when we say religious none, we're not, religious nuns, they aren't automatically classified as atheist. They just might not identify with an organized religion. They might be spiritual. Okay. So I know that's, some people tend to confuse the religious none with spiritual but non-religious, but we're going to outline the differences. So with a religious none, a person would say, if they were asked, what religion do you have? They would say, none. So that's pretty much it. Secular. This is basically a term used to describe things that are not religious in orientation. So a lot of times when people hear secular, they automatically think atheism or agnosticism, non-religiosity, things like that. But when we think about secularity, secularity is anything that isn't religious in nature. So if we think about, I don't know, riding your bike, unless like that has some ties to your faith, it's not a it's a secular activity, right? So really, it's in reference to like the lack of presence in an activity, lack of religious presence or orientation in an activity. Spiritual but not religious, SNBR. This is a term used to describe a person who they identify with a spiritual life stance, but they do not identify with an organized religion. SNBRs, they typically get a lot of backlash because they're seen as copping out of being part of that faith. And to be quite honest, that's far from it. According to some research, people who identify as spiritual but not religious, they cite their disagreement with aspects or the whole part of organized religion. So you can have faith and not be religious. So as I'm talking about all these terms, really when you think about religiosity and non-religiosity, think of it as a spectrum, okay? Typically people who are at the extremes, you have people who are at the extremes, then you have people who are not so much at the extremes, but not in the middle. Then you have those folks who are in the middle, okay? Christian hegemony. So we're going to be talking a lot about this particular term throughout our lecture. So Christian hegemony is basically the cultural assumptions, norms, and beliefs that have Protestant Christian origins, right? So we're going to outline specifically what does that look like and how has it occurred within the United States. So before we get into that, I wanted to show you guys this. It's in your book. It's about America's changing religious landscape. So if you are not familiar with the PEW, they do a lot of research, a lot of surveys, and primarily the United States has been predominantly Christian for a very, 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 very long time. In 2015, the PEW did a survey asking people about their faith, non-faith, what have you, and there was some interesting findings, and I wanted to highlight that in this lecture. So with their findings, let me go back here. So with their findings, they found that there was a growing secularity in US America and decreasing numbers of Christianity. So when we look at Christianity, there's breakdowns. You have different branches of Christianity. You have the Protestant Christians, mainline, Baptist, um, historically Black, Catholic, Mormon, Jehovah's Witnesses. Um, let's see what else here. Orthodox Christian, and then you have the other Christian. What they found as a whole was that the number of people, the percentage of people who identified as Christian, which was 78.4, dropped to 70.6 in 2014. So that was a 7.8 decrease in Christianity. Now, what we've noticed when we look at that specifically, people in like the Protestant sect, a negative 0.4, 0.8 decrease. So they went from 51 to 46. You did see a little bit of rises in non-Christian faiths, but what you also found was that there was an increase in folks who identified as unaffiliated. So unaffiliated in 2007 was 16.1, and there was an increase to 22.8, 6.7, a 6.7 increase. So what this is suggesting, taking the study together, what this is suggesting is that people are leaving organized Christian faiths and moving towards more secular forms of living. Some folks are identifying as atheist, as agnostic, or as a religious nun. So this was really interesting. So taken together, what you saw is, or what we're currently seeing in US America, is that there are more people that are identifying as unaffiliated and more people leaving the Christian faith. Notably, we have noticed some things with race, some racial differences when it comes to religious identification. So, for example, within the literature, it's common, it's more, white people are more likely to identify as unaffiliated, specifically atheist, than people of color. So what we've noticed in the literature, that the predominant amount of people that make up that atheist community are cis, white, rich dudes who are also who are younger. And you don't see too many people of color identifying as atheists or explicitly identifying as atheist. Even further, you don't see a lot of women as atheists either. So researchers are suggesting that people of color may be actually underreporting, or they're afraid to identify as atheist or as or on the non-religious spectrum due to stigma. If you've known the history of when we look at the history of certain groups, certain communities of color, such as the Black community, there has been a strong tie between faith and racial oppression, right? So in the beginning, there was the forcing of Christian faith onto African slaves, right? However, when African slaves started to read, they started identifying different passages that went against slavery. They turned that, in some cases, African slaves, they blended some Christian, some aspects of the Christian faith with their own faith, right? So when you look at the history of the Black community, um, faith, Christian faith in particular, was used as means of coping with racial oppression. And even further, when we think about the civil rights movement, right? You had Dr. Martin Luther King, who was also a preacher at the time, using faith as a way to say, hey, racial segregation is really fucked up. You also had Malcolm X, who was also mentioning his faith uh, or using his faith as a vehicle for towards the end of racial oppression. Um, and of note, we do see a lot of Black folks who are identifying as Christian in the media. You don't see a lot of Black folks who are identifying as atheist. Same thing with those with other folks of color. So going back to the study, what they found was that people who, while Black folks make up 13% of the U.S. Make up 13% of U.S. America, they make up more than half of belief in Christian faith. So this is interesting. So like when we look at the historically Black Christian faiths, it didn't budge. However, researchers are suggesting that it's that folks of color, particularly Black folks, experience stigma when they do identify as identify on the non-religious spectrum. So that was really interesting. So what are some factors in regards to America's changing landscape? So if you think about it, think about technology. So with the rise of technology, the rise in science, you've had people beginning to look at these, examine their own stuff, if you think about it, and you might see a lot more people just switching faiths, or going into non-faiths. So some researchers are suggesting that the reason why you're seeing these changes is that there are people leaving the Christian faith and going to another faith, or they're identifying as non-religious. So they might be identifying as atheist, agnostics, religious none, so forth and so on. There's also like a generational displacement. So when you think about people who are younger, they're more likely to identify as secular or on the non-religious spectrum, or compared to older folks, right? So taken together, when you really think about it, this is big. This is really big. So I'll have the link in the PowerPoint slides for you to go have a look at it and note what you think. So while we still see this decrease in the Christian faith still remains the predominant identity that is represented, right? It's still dominant. So we're going to talk about faith oppression. And when it comes to faith, the folks who are part of the privileged group, part of that Asian group, right, are Christians. So when we think about Christians, or when we think about Christian privilege, what comes to your mind? So your book talks about different examples of Christian privilege, So let's go through them. The first one, you can expect to have time off to work, time off of work to celebrate religious holidays. So let's think about, I don't know, Christmas, right? Uh, when it comes to winter break, folks get off of work for those holidays, right? Another one, spring break. Uh, we did get out of spring break around Easter time. So when we think about the world of work, the world of work does revolve around Christian-based holidays. And we're going to talk about the ways in which those holidays the ways in which Christian holidays originated in the next lecture, because they're not the origins are not Christian at all. Instead, pagan. It's related to pagan holidays. But we'll talk more about that when we get to Constantine. Music and television programs pertaining to your religion's holidays are readily accessible. All you have to do to hear Mariah Carey, Mariah Carey's, but like Christmas-y songs, right? Or Christmas holiday specials, right? It's just type it into YouTube, type it into Google, type it into Bing, type it into your search engine, and boom, it's there. When you think about other songs of other faiths, so such as that of that for Islam, right? You don't see that too often. As a matter of fact, that might be flagged down as like dangerous, or it might not even be on those websites. Holidays celebrating your faith are so widely supported, you ought to forget they are limited to your faith. When we think about when it comes to holiday time, right, specifically winter holidays, we wish people Merry Christmas. We say, I was about to say Happy Christmas, but I have seen some people do that to me. We also have signs that reflect that. We have signs that reflect Christian holiday, the Christian God. You also see some signs that says keep Christ in Christmas or keep Christ in Xmas. If you think about that, imagine being a person of a different faith and not being able to find decorations, or not being able to or having a harder time saying something of the holiday because people would not favor it, right? So that's something to think about. When was the last time you've seen decorations or someone saying saying happy holiday or whatever, or celebrating their faith in their language? And when I mean their language, I mean in terms of their faith. You can worship freely without fear of violence or threats. So thinking about this one, if you look at the town of Ruston, there are a large amount of churches here, right? How often do you see a place of in an Islamic place of worship? And there's a good reason why you may not be aware of where it is. So with the Islamic places of worship, right, in Ruston, and in most places, they're typically hidden, because of something we're going to talk about, Islamophobia, right? So to be quite clear, when it comes to, and even let's say we did see a person of the Islamic faith praying on a sidewalk, right? Or having to do it in, maybe they might be in a school and they have to do it. There is the threat of violence for someone practicing a faith, especially that of the Muslim Islamic faith, in public, they're in freely, right? When someone gets on the ground to pray and pray to the Christian God, no one bats an eye. Another example, let's think about the football games. Tim Tebow, when he do the kneeling thing. Imagine if you had a football player who displays an expression of gratitude in their faith outside of Christianity. Do you think people would appreciate that? Not really, especially not even at a football game. But even at a football game, there is still references of the Christian God. So when we think about Louisiana Tech, for example, and some other institutions that do this in the South, we pray at, there's the Christian prayers, right, before games. Louisiana Tech is a public institution. It's supposed to be keeping the separation of church and state. Think about that. Of note, there are multiple Christian groups on Louisiana Tech. Do you get to see a lot of the non-religious groups or the secular groups on Louisiana Tech's campus? Positive references to your faith are seen dozens of times a day by everyone, regardless of their faith. So like if you wanted to just turn on the TV, there's a greater chance that people are going to positively reference Christianity, right? There are a plethora of channels of the Christian faith to worship, to help that person worship, and talking about people's testimonies of positive testimonies of Christianity. You don't see too much about it of people of the other faith, people of other faiths or non-faiths. Politicians can make decisions citing your faith without being labeled as heretics or extremists. When we think about our politicians, majority of them identify with the Christian faith. And of note, they make decisions based upon their faith. Now, if you understand the separation of church and state, you would understand that this is a big problem because it's not being, I don't want to say reprimanded, but it's not being held accountable, right? When we think about the heartbeat bill that was passed in Louisiana, the governor did state that he always was for life. He's a Christian. He believes in the value of life, right? Other governors have cited that. It is easy to find your faith accurately depicted in television, movies, books, and other media. So when we think about the Christian faith, for example, right, there are a large amount of media that depicts Christianity as positive, right? And if there's a film or a book or TV show or some other form of media that depicts anything else other than the Christian faith, more times it's not depicted accurately. There's a lot of stereotypes. Just as examples. In the event of a divorce, the judge won't immediately grant custody of your children to your ex because of your faith. So there have been cases where, in the cases of custody hearings, children are granted custody to a person's ex-partner due to the other person being a specific faith. So folks who identify with the Islamic faith, who identify as a Hindu, Sikh, or atheist, as an example, they are less likely to have their kids granted to them in custody because of their faith and non-faith beliefs. So taken as a whole, when we think about Christian privilege, and this is, to be quite clear, these are only just a couple that are in your book. When we think about Christian privilege, it's very wide ranging. And with Christian privilege, it maintains faith-based oppression, Christian hegemony at the individual and interpersonal level. So as I mentioned, these are just examples. I'll make sure to put a list of Christian privileges in Moodle for your viewing. So now we're going to talk about phases of religious oppression. So the first one we're going to talk about is powerlessness, right? So when we think about powerlessness, subordinated groups have less access to social power than members of dominant groups. So if we think about, for example, the indigenous peoples. So going back to the historical foundations in the colonial periods, the spiritual beliefs and identity that were foundational to the native peoples, they were violently confronted with those of the Christian European colonists, right? When we think about the Pilgrims, as we were taught in U.S. American history, right? They were fleeing religious persecution, and they met the indigenous peoples and they made friends with them, right? We celebrate that at Thanksgiving. That's not what the hell happened, to be quite honest. The Pilgrims believed that they were chosen by the Christian God to establish a commonwealth that was meant to expand the word of God. Even further, they crafted, so to be quite frank, the Puritans crafted their own form of Christianity. And with this form of Christianity, there was references to other races as heathens, as infidels, and specifically they were referring to the indigenous peoples. So after the Puritans landed on North America, you saw other Christian settlers coming in from Europe, and these Christian settlers were predominantly Protestant based. And what you found was that Protestants, when they established political power in certain areas, the legislators passed anti-Catholic legislation, and it banished Jesuits from the territory. So taken together, what we see with the pattern of Protestant domination of the subordinate religious groups, right? It continued from the colonial period to this day. Now, of note, the book did reference World War II. Whenever there was like a mass relocation effort, where approximately 112,000 Japanese Americans were placed in concentration camps, right? And these camps were very, very far from their homes. And it's important to note that many of them, if the majority of them, were Buddhist. And if you understand the Buddhist faith, and while Buddhism has different facets, it's primarily of peace. It has a peace, an orientation towards peace. So we see that with powerlessness. Exploitation, basically there's that process of transfer of the results based on the labor of one group to benefit another. And we saw that throughout the colonial period, specifically with chattel slavery, right? Race and religion like intersected just as a justification for slavery. So there were references to Black Africans as heathens, as infidels, and they were taken from their land and forced into slavery. And people, and I say people, but Protestant Christians justified this slavery with it being their burden to bear, right? They are responsible for promoting the word of God amongst these amongst the Africans, and to get them to be believers. Well, if you ask me, that's kind of like a slap in the face. Even further, there were slave ships with Christian names on it, such as Jesus, the grace of God, Angel, Justice. And you had a lot of Christian ministers on board to help oversee the passage. In the 1840s, the Baptist General Convention, well, some of the members, they organized a separate Southern Baptist Convention with a spiel on the benefits of slavery. So they were providing a pro-slavery platform. Now, 1840s, 150 years later, did this same institution, the Southern Baptist Convention, apologize to Black folks for the support, right, for this institution of slavery. And then also apologized for rejection of civil rights in the 1950s and 60s. So taken together, when we're looking at chattel slavery, there was a lot of religious justification for it, right? And we've also seen religious justification for the expansion from the east to west. So in a couple lectures ago, I talked about manifest destiny. So let me get there. So manifest destiny was this belief that God intended the U.S. to expand across the Northern America, going over indigenous tribes. So when we think about manifest destiny, it wasn't a document. This was more of an idea. It was this belief. And additionally, it supported and assumed an Anglo-Saxon superiority. So basically suggesting that white Christians, white Protestant Christians deserve to, or were intended to expand the US America from east to west. When it came to talking about natural resources, when we think about forest, right? There were conversations between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and they advocated using indigenous people's lands for farming to make money. Now, when we look at this particular view, right, it's very capitalistic, money making, right? That wasn't the living or wasn't the beliefs of indigenous peoples. Instead, the forest was there to, the forest and really the earth, the planet, was for everyone to share and to take care of. Everyone has a role to play in taking care of the planet. However, you had Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time in 1803. He wrote a letter to Andrew Jackson telling him to convince the indigenous folks to sell their land to the government and to become farmers. So what you saw is, so taken together with exploitation, what you saw was the use, the trade, as a result of African slaves, indigenous peoples' resources, right, to benefit white Protestant Christians. So you saw the undermining of African folks, of indigenous peoples' faiths and beliefs for the Christian faith. Marginalization. So when we think about marginalization, basically, this is where a whole group of people, in this case, non-Protestant Christians, they're restricted from meaningful involvement in the social life of the community and nation, and they're subjected to economic deprivation and even annihilation, right? So we see this in schools and within society. The media constitutes like a major way of transmitting religious norms and beliefs, and then maintaining the marginalization of the other. So if we think about the ways in which the discourses on Islamic faith, indigenous peoples' faiths, right? It's typically mocked, made fun of. People make a lot of references to Islamic faith as being scary. For a long time, amongst Fox News, you heard a lot of people talking about this thing of Sharia law. And if you look that up, you'll see that it's if you look up the discussions of Sharia law on Fox News, it's pretty funny. But the point is, when we talk about non-Protestant Christians, they're typically talked about in a negative way. The discourse is typically negative. When we think about schooling, right? There's a certain norms and certain norms of Christian privilege and marginalization of members of other faith communities and non-faith communities. They're conveyed in the curricular materials of schools. So this can focus on like the heroes, traditions, holidays, accomplishments. So when we think about these things, they all are centered around Protestant Christianity, right? And even further, when we think about holidays or the school calendar, students of different faiths might be compelled to request certain days off. So if you think about students, Jewish students, they have to put in a request for an excuse from school to attend religious services for high holy days, on and between Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. And that falls at like during the beginning of the academic year. Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't celebrate holidays, but they have to seek permission to be excused from observance of holidays on schools, right? So we also think about Muslim students, faculty, and staff, right? When they have to have a safe prayer space on campus to say their prayers, that's required by the 5 pillars of Islam. So when we think about that, people of different faith communities and even non-faith communities are subjected to different norms of Christianity, right? And they have to go around making they experience more barriers to practice their own faiths. Oops, why is it doing that? That's so weird. That's weird. Anyways, so let me side note. So when we think about accomplishments, well, not accomplishments, but traditions, right? The Pledge of Allegiance is pretty much one of them. So when we think about the Pledge of Allegiance, it has one nation under God. So how can I say this? So what I'm talking about is cultural imperialism, right? So, and I'll make sure to have this, have these notes in there. So cultural imperialism is basically like the universalization of a dominant group's experiences and culture. So what we see is Christian cultural imperialism and privilege. Society marks time through a Christian lens. So, well, let me go back to the holidays. So, highlighting holidays, right? So, when we think about our society revolves around the Christian time, or through the lens of Christians. So when we think about the 21st century, we're in the year 2020. We know the earth did not, we know like the earth did not form 20 years ago, 2020 years ago, right? Um, when we look at it, it's actually in reference to Jesus's birth. So the century markers BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, are of Christian origin. So when we look at the book talks about the 21st century as a new millennium, um, it's an important milestone for Christians, and it also marks heightened invisibility other um, of other faiths. The work week is also scheduled around Christians to give them the opportunity to celebrate on Sundays and not interfere with the Monday to Friday work week. So when we think about uh, state and local blue laws, they restrict sales, business operations, recreational activities, and governmental services on Sunday, which is a Sabbath for most Christian denominations. And the blue laws, they go back to colonial times when Sunday church attendance was mandatory. Okay. So if you think about if you go to Super One today, I say today on Sunday, right? You will not be able to buy beer. Same thing in Walmart. All right. So moving along, going to the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Uh, there's references to the Christian God, and I want to point out that the Pledge of Allegiance, the one nation under God, was not added until 1954. This was whenever we saw the beef between the Soviet Union and U.S. That phrase was added to unite people, unite Christians. And I want to be clear, there were people of other faiths in the United States. So if there was suggestion of what about one nation under Buddha, that would probably not happen because predominantly the US America is Christian. When we think about the deculturalization and schooling of Native peoples in this country, there was a lot of stuff there. So what we saw was the undermining of Indigenous peoples' identities, their beliefs and their cultures and their languages, and then the forced confiscation of land and relocation. So white European American settlers, they basically took the land from the Indigenous peoples, told them to kick rocks, and was like, screw your beliefs, and forced conversion onto them, forced Christian conversion onto them through schooling. So young Indigenous boys, their hair was cut. They were banned from using any of their languages, referencing their beliefs, and they were forced to learn about Christianity. Oh, that's why. it went behind. Huh. But so I know that came kind of late, but I hope all this makes sense. And there you go. Just as a solidifier about our phrases. And there. All right, so violence. So we have seen a number of increases of religious violence in recent years. We've seen it a lot in the past. During colonial times, what you saw, you had a lot of religious violence going on and about. The Pilgrims, for example, they basically like scared the shit out of a merchant who was Jewish. And they also banished Quakers from their town. The thing about it is, well, the Quakers kept going to Puritan towns. The Puritans provided harsher penalties, such as cutting off ears, using hot irons to make holes in their tongues. And then between 1659 and 1651, Puritans killed like 4 Quakers on the gallows. So religious violence is so to be quite clear, when people say, I can't believe religious violence is a thing nowadays. No, within US America, it always has been a thing. Even further than that, right? When we talk about the Crusades, millions of Jewish and Islamic and Muslim folks died in that war because you had a lot of back and forth with Christians about what land they are entitled to own, are entitled to have, right? It wasn't about the faith itself. It was about the power and the use of religion and the use of faith to justify the taking of that power, to justify the taking of that land. Yeah. So we have seen an increase in hate crimes against Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, and Jewish folks. Excuse me. They've escalated since September 11th, 2001, so 9/11. Nearly 1/4 of all reported civil rights violations against American Muslims involve unwarranted arrests and searches. So you see this racial profiling, or this profiling of Middle Eastern folks, or folks who Middle Eastern. Excuse me. Let me back up. So you see this profiling of Muslims who appear of Middle Eastern heritage, right? You might see that in airports, or driving in their cars for interrogation, or simply while they're driving. You also see like federal agencies like the IRS and FBI to enter homes and mosques to make unreasonable arrests and detentions, right? Also, students who are Muslim, undergraduate students who are Muslim, they do report experiences of anti-Islamic discriminations, and hate crimes. Sikhs have also been a target of hate crimes as well. The Sikh Coalition organization listed 62 hate crimes directed against Sikh citizens in the United States. Many of these attacks that were committed against Sikhs were classified underneath the category of personal attacks or assaults, as well as vandalism or arson. Hindus have also been a target of hate crimes in particular. So folks have reported experiences of being robbed, being burned with cigarettes, beaten up. And the most notable case was Saru Balero. And this was a 24-year-old Indian graduate student. He studied in Massachusetts. He was robbed, burned with cigarettes, beaten up, stuffed in a truck, and stabbed before he was being dumped on the road. Apparently, the attackers misidentified him for being a Muslim. So there's that. You've also seen the increase in violence against Jewish folks in the recent years as well. The Anti-Defamation League documented several thousands of incidents of hate crimes against Jewish folks. So about 1,500 incidents in 2004 alone. There was also burning of a Holocaust museum in Indiana, spray painting of swastikas and epithets on the walls of a driveway of the Jewish community. So taken together, whenever we're looking at religious violence, we've seen an increase of it, right? So here I have a link. I would highly encourage y'all to look at this link on hate crimes. Very, very informative. What you see is the report of hate crimes against different marginalized communities of faith. So taken together, when we look at religious oppression, you notice something. It isn't just based on a singular based oppression, right? It's not just only based on faith. You see the intersections of race and faith all throughout this lecture. And with that intersection, that has led U.S. Americans to some very serious immigration shit, right? So, for example, you saw a lot of nativist policies in the 19th century and into the 20th century. And when I mean nativist, it refers to anti-immigrant ideology by US-born European heritage Protestants. And these are typically directed against non-Protestant Christians and non-Protestant Christian ethnic and religious groups. So there was a lot of strong nativist currents against Asian Muslims, Sikh, and Buddhist immigrants. And this led the US Congress to ban Chinese immigrants in 1882, and also made it illegal for Chinese folks to marry white or Black Americans. There were a lot of people who came out and spoke against this, spoke up in favor of this act. This was the Immigration Act of 1917, and also further banned immigration from countries from certain banned zones, so parts of China, India, Siam, Burma, Asiatic Russia, Polynesian Islands, and parts of Afghanistan. Within recent years, you have seen even further that Muslim ban, right? So a couple of years ago, Donald Trump, that dude, the president put a Muslim ban, right? So you had a whole bunch of people who were separated from their families. And when you looked at it as a whole, you saw it was typically Muslims of color, Black and brown Muslims. So taken together with this lecture, when we look at oppression, right, especially religious oppression, it isn't just based on the singular axis. There's the intersections of different identities, and of note, different intersections of race and faith. So that's it for this lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Oop, don't need to see that, not yet.